W5.
Who but a sex maniac could be committing crimes like this?
A city terrorized by brutal, unsolved murders.
One or more of the crimes was committed by the same individual.
It really was brutal and unfair.
We can't let people murder children and get away with it.
And
Dude, what away we go!
a family legacy forged in smoke and metal.
You gotta keep moving. That's the key to it. Keep moving. I'm gonna do my best to beat him, yeah.
That's like my happy place. I like wrecking cars. It's fun.
CTV's W5 with Avery Haines, Omar Sachedina, and Lisa LaFlamme. Here is Avery Haines.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. As a destination, the city of London, Ontario, prides itself as a must-visit with natural beauty, culture, and entertainment. But the Forest City, as it's known, has a past that the tourist brochures don't talk about. A string of unsolved murders, possibly serial killings, stretching back decades, where so far the killer or killers have literally gotten away with murder. It's a damp autumn night in the parking lot of a strip mall in London, Ontario. A small crowd has gathered for a somber ceremony.
Tonight here, it's like a sacred site.
And to retrace the final steps of a 15-year-old girl who vanished after leaving her part-time job at a diner. Her name was Jackie English. Tonight is the 50th anniversary of her disappearance.
It's important to me because Jackie wasn't here long enough to make her mark.
Jackie English's sister Anne leads the group over the Wellington Road Bridge. It's a walk that all those years ago, Jackie never finished.
Jackie left right behind us at 10 p.m. on October the 4th, and she had to cross the overpass to catch a bus, and she never made it. She made it about halfway up the overpass.
We have information that the girl was seen shortly after 10 o'clock getting into a dark-colored car which was proceeding north on the Wellington Road.
October 4th, 1969. Jackie walked alone across the bridge. Witnesses saw a car pull up. Jackie got into the back seat and was never seen again alive.
She was last seen going up the overpass towards London.
Those days were horrible. My mother was frantic. We went out looking every day, looking on streets, in fields. That's how we spent our days, was looking for Jackie, looking for items of clothing. Everybody loses people that we love. That's part of life. But this was so unfair. It really, really was brutal and unfair.
Jackie was missing for 5 excruciating days before her family got the news. Her nude body had been found in a creek almost 70 kilometers away near Tilsonburg, a rural community known for tobacco growing, not murder.
It was here, by the bridge just behind me, on the 10th concession of South Norwich Township, the 2 Woodstock area men found the body of 15-year-old Jacqueline Louise English of London in the Big Otter Creek.
A brutal crime like this in a small city like London should have been a rarity, but it wasn't. In fact, Jackie's sister Anne had a gnawing gut feeling from the moment her sister disappeared.
I just knew that Jackie wasn't, I don't know.
You just knew what?
That Jackie wasn't coming home. I knew immediately.
What do you mean by that, though?
Other children had gone missing in London and turned up dead.
Other children had turned up dead. The murder of Jackie English was the 8th unsolved killing of a child or young woman in just 21 months, a killing spree that began the year before Jackie disappeared. In January of 1968, 16-year-old Jackie Dunleavy was last seen getting into a vehicle after leaving her part-time job. Her partially clothed body was found later that night in a parking lot. In just the next 2 months, 2 boys, 9-year-old Frankie Jensen and 16-year-old Scott Leishman, were abducted and killed. 11-year-old Robert Stapleton disappeared the next year. 2 of the boys were later found floating in water. The third was discovered in a bush lot. 3 other young women were murdered: 19-year-old Linda White, 22-year-old Patricia Bovin, 31-year-old Helga Beer. And then, on October 4th, 1969, 15-year-old Jackie English became the 8th child or young woman to be murdered in less than 2 years.
Police are on the alert for any car with a considerable amount of blood in it, or any location where there is a lot of blood around.
Reporter George Clark, who covered many of the unsolved murders, has long since retired, but remembers clearly the chill in the small city of London.
There was concern in the community. Obviously, young people were being kidnapped and killed. We thought we were having individual murders that just happened to occur in London.
Despite all of these headlines of gruesome, gruesome crimes against women and children, no one thought to say, are these related? Is one person responsible? Or are there a number of serial killers walking the streets of London?
Back then, we thought we had a series of murders, but not due to a serial killer. The concept of a serial killer didn't really come out until the late 1970s, early 1980s in the United States.
But even though law enforcement in North America hadn't yet coined the phrase serial killer, reporter George Clark and others were back then asking all the right questions.
But in consultations with the officers from the forces in the area, have you not meshed anything that might lead to a suspected tie-in?
Not at this point.
You mentioned at a meeting last week at City Hall that you felt there was a sex maniac on the loose in this area. Do you still feel this way?
Yes, I do, because obviously we look back at some of these crimes, and who but a sex maniac, I mean, would be committing crimes like this?
It's one of the oldest myths in the book that serial killers want to be caught.
Michael Arnfield is an associate professor at Western University in London, Ontario. The former London City police officer runs a cold case society with some of his students. He's also spent years researching the unsolved murders of women and children in the London area dating back to the 1950s.
Do you believe that Jackie English was a victim of a serial killer?
Absolutely. The telltale markers are there, the links to at least 3 other crimes, and this has been peer-reviewed internationally by the leading homicide scholars, my colleagues, who say, what the hell happened here?
But it's not just Jackie English's murder being linked to 3 or 4 other crimes. What Professor Arnfeld has to say about serial killers in London is nothing short of a bombshell.
Based on the available data, London, Ontario had more serial killers per capita, a greater serial killer to citizen ratio than any other city on this continent, specifically over a 25-year period.
London, Ontario calls itself the Forest City.
Right.
You have a far more ominous nickname for this city.
I do.
Murder City.
Correct. If London had New York City's population, there'd be 80 to 90 serial killers walking the streets of the 5 boroughs at any given time.
And that's because in the 60s and 70s, the London area was the hunting ground for at least 3 separate serial killers with sensational nicknames, all of whom were later arrested and taken off the streets. The Chambermaid Slayer, the Mad Slasher, and the Balcony Strangler.
Russell Johnson, aka the Balcony Strangler, went to the gym every day to train to be able to scale the exteriors of buildings, climb in unlocked balconies, find women sleeping alone, murder them, clean their apartments, and then leave.
The second, Christian McGee, the Mad Slasher, who raped and killed 3 teenagers, including a 15-year-old.
And the third?
Gerald Thomas Archer, aka the Chambermaid Slayer.
And what did he do, the Chambermaid Slayer?
He had a propensity for targeting specifically housekeeping attendants at low-rent hotels.
3 serial killers with a body count between them of 10 in a population at the time of about 200,000. But that leaves an additional 15 murders of women and children between 1959 and 1983 still unsolved. How many serial killers do you believe either were out there or are now out there that haven't been charged?
I believe there's one still living that hasn't been charged, possibly two.
We had children stolen from us, and we can't let people murder children and get away with it. That is absurd.
Vanessa Brown owns a bookstore in downtown London and is a local historian. She's spent the last 5 years researching London's horrifying history for her own book, The Forest City Killer.
There are a lot of cold cases here and a lot of families that are still actively mourning and grieving their lost loved ones, and they deserve justice.
Vanessa is also an amateur sleuth and has been digging through archives, old police records, and interviewing residents. She says the Jackie English murder was a tipping point.
The city went crazy. When Jackie died, it was like, this is the straw that's broke the camel's back.
You, in your research, came across the serial killer who is still on the loose.
Yeah, the serial killer who's never been caught, right? Who came into London and murdered our children for 2 years and just left. I mean, he's still out there, which is absurd to me.
Coming up.
This is where her body was found.
Is a known killer walking free?
He outsmarted everyone. He literally got away with murder.
When W5 continues.
This is London, Ontario, about 2 hours west of Toronto. More than 400 parks are dotted throughout the city, which is ringed by a series of superhighways. But as far back as the early 1960s, this small city has had a big problem with serial killers. 3 serial killers who were eventually taken off the streets killed at least 10 young women. But there are still 15 unsolved cases of murdered women and children from 1959 to 1983. And there's growing speculation that at least one or more serial killers is responsible.
This is where her body was found.
Michael Arnfield is an associate professor at Western University and has been researching the unsolved murders for years.
What makes London, Ontario a magnet for serial killers?
I call it the canary in the coal mine for not only Canada, but North America in terms of the phenomenon of serial murder. The term really wasn't even a household term until the late 70s, and yet you see it happening in London by the early 60s. And then you have to then question, well, why London as sort of the early bird?
For one, the creation of a series of highways around the once isolated city.
London was one of the early outpost cities along the King's Highway. London becomes sort of a mecca for previously unconnected small towns outside the city that can now make use of a newly minted highway and come in, acquire victims, and be gone before the police even knew what was going on.
A memorial was recently held to mark the 50th anniversary of the death of 15-year-old Jackie English, one of the unsolved murder victims. Vanessa Brown was among the dozens who gathered.
The purpose of the Walk for Jackie is to reenact her final steps. Those final steps of freedom, really the last thing she ever got to do of her own volition in life.
Vanessa and Associate Professor Michael Arnfield, a former London police officer, along with his Cold Case Society at Western University, believe there is glaring evidence that whoever killed Jackie English had killed before. It's a theory that in part is because of the work of this man, OPP Detective Sergeant Dennis Alsop.
Here's a guy who finds himself essentially on the front lines of a crisis in policing and serial homicide for which there was no precedent in this country.
Detective Sergeant Alsop was the lead investigator in many of the unsolved crimes. When he died in 2012, he left bankers' boxes filled with all his police notes and diaries, documents which were discovered by his son, Dennis Jr.
When I found the files, I was blown away. He did not leave this for it to be untouched.
The Jackie English murder and the fact your dad couldn't solve it haunted him.
Oh, it haunted him big time. Jackie English was the #1 case in my books for my dad. He wanted this one. He thought he had a chance of solving it.
So some of these files obviously pertain to the potential serial killer.
Deep within the paperwork left behind, a confidential police report detailing the case of Jackie English. It also included the names of other unsolved murder victims, and it ends with this: if one can believe any of these deaths are related to the English murder, in all probability, we're searching for some form of sexual psychopath.
I'm imagining those notes would be fairly vital to any police now who are wanting to solve cold cases.
Apart from being archival and apart from being fascinating from a documentary perspective and a historical perspective, they hold tremendous investigative leads that were never followed up on. And certainly someone could pick up where he left off.
More than 5 decades after Detective Sergeant Dennis Alsop started trying to connect the dots, former London police officer Michael Arnfield is picking up the same pieces. According to Arnfield, a series of unsolved, brutal killings of young women began with the rape and murder of Georgia Jackson. The 20-year-old waitress disappeared after work in February of 1966. Georgia's mother received a taunting phone call after her disappearance.
I said, "Is this you, Georgie?" And she said, the voice said then, "Yes, Mom." She says, "Some men are holding me."
Police distributed this missing person notice and spent nearly a month searching before her mutilated body was found in a farmer's field. This autopsy report, found amongst Detective Sergeant Alsop's notes, shows she had been raped and murdered. Her ear had been cleanly sliced off, and a strip of flesh was missing from her left arm. Almost 6 years later, a man named David Botimer, who had a history of exposing himself in public, confessed to the crime. The married father of 5 went to the same congregation as Georgia Jackson. Detective Sergeant Alsop's handwritten notes include the actual confession.
That would mark the first murder in the set, murders that stopped after that killer was arrested several years later.
In June of 1972, David Botimer was convicted of non-capital murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He served 10 years behind bars. But in the 6 years between when Georgia Jackson was murdered and David Botimer's confession, there were 9 unsolved killings of women and children. According to Michael Arnfield, some of the crimes have alarming similarities.
Transportation over extreme distances, hours with a body on board a vehicle in most or all cases. Scattering of belongings, and most disturbingly, returning to the crime scene and leaving some type of shrine or item belonging to the victim at the crime scene. You don't need to be a homicide scholar or a decorated academic to understand these links.
Look at these faces, children and young women, all of them murdered,
some of them raped.
No one has ever been charged. If this had happened today, people would be beating down the door to the police demanding answers. And really, there are only 2 scenarios.
Either multiple people got away with murder,
or this is the work of one or more serial killers.
Detective Superintendent Martin Graham is with the Criminal Investigation Bureau at the Ontario Provincial Police.
It is completely shocking to me that there were so many murders back in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, when you look at the temporal and the geographical connections, it would understandably, people would now look back and feel there'd be some sort of connection. The reality is that even to this date, the confirmation forensically or otherwise to show that they are in fact physically connected in any fashion has not been shown to be.
It must be a working theory that some of these crimes were committed by one person killing more than one person.
It has to be a working theory. It has to be.
What is the working theory?
That one or more of the crimes was committed by the same individual.
David Botimer is a name that comes up again and again in our investigation. Is he considered a suspect?
I will neither confirm nor deny anybody if there are suspects or persons of interest in the file of any of the unsolved homicides that we're referring to.
David Botimer is now a 74-year-old father and grandfather, living with his second wife in a city outside Toronto. His conviction for the sex slaying of Georgia Jackson was decades before sex offenders were required to provide a sample to the National DNA Database. Producer Stephen Grant and I paid Mr. Botimer a visit.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Botimer.
Yeah.
It's Avery Haines from W5.
No, thank you. No comment.
Well, we just wanted to speak to you briefly because we're doing an investigation on the unsolved murders in London.
Yeah.
And your name keeps coming up again and again in this investigation.
They did, the OPPs did a little while ago, like a true serum thing, and I was cleared.
So how long ago was that, David?
About a year ago.
A year ago, the OPP, because the OPP contacted you and said they'd done a truth serum?
I met them in Toronto. Yeah.
Our police sources have told us that you're a person of interest.
No, I was all cleared.
Can you tell me about Georgia Jackson?
No, thank you.
It's not clear how many suspects are still at large in the decades-old murders, but high-level police sources confirmed to W5 that David Botimer has not been excluded as a person of interest. And the OPP say there is no such thing as a truth serum, and they've not conducted any recent tests on David Botimer.
So what is that?
This is Jackie's diary. This was the evidence bag. It was sealed when I received it, so obviously...
It's been 50 years of agony for Anne English, whose sister Jackie was murdered at the age of 15. She's well aware of the theories surrounding her sister's murder, and like everyone else, she's still looking for answers.
We all think if we had done one thing differently, but I know it's not true.
There's the possibility that the person who killed your sister is still alive.
I think he must be very, very proud of himself. He outsmarted everyone. He literally got away with murder.
The Ontario Provincial Police say the unsolved murder cases are still open and under investigation. They've set up a hotline for tips. You can find their number along with more about our story online at w5.ctvnews.ca.